Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you very much for pitching up and talking about people that I say will become extinct. I think you would want to hear my reasons for this, although at the moment it of course doesn't look like that. I must say about 6 months ago I didn't know there would be a book like this, and I didn't know what the title would be. So I didn't set out in order to write a book with this conclusion. But in the course of assembling some of the articles I've written over the last 30-40 years, I actually think it was in me, the book, and I had to get it out. Perhaps thinking about the future, one of the most perspective comments on South Africa was written by the Afrikaans author Louis Leipold, who lived in the first half of this century. He wrote several very moving poems after the Anglo-Boer War. He was then actually in England when he wrote them. But also in the subsequent period, he wrote some very remarkable Afrikaans poetry. In fact, the television series that I presented on the Afrikaans television starts with one of these poems which was set in music, 'n handvol grys in die hand aan wyk. So it is still very much part of my kind of frame of reference. But it's the poem that he wrote in 1947, the year that he died. He was a medical doctor, and he lived in Cape Town, and he was known for his let's say, original views. The poem is called Chess in South Africa. The much belauded fool looked wise and pondered what he saw. I think he said that if he tries, white still might make a draw. The master smiled and shook his head. Quote, "You've left it all too late. There's no doubt of it," he said. "It's back to move and mate." The other one is a prediction by Etienne Leroux, perhaps the greatest Afrikaans novelist, who lived in the Free State. His father was a cabinet minister. Became very good friends with Graham Greene, and I think Graham Greene described him as and he visited him on his farm. They started to correspond. He visited Greene in France or in the Mediterranean island, and Greene visited him on a farm near Koffiefontein in the Free State. And Etienne Leroux he wrote to Jan Rabie, a fellow Afrikaans writer, "And now, Jan, I'll tell you what will happen. Our gods have been vanquished. The night lies emasculated in the cellar. The foundation of the fortress begins to crumble, and there are only 3 different outcomes possible. The first is to put on a sackcloth and step out to meet the enemy. Second is to defend the fortress with blood, tears, and shame. Third one is to withdraw and think back longingly about a glorious past while awaiting the death blow." Now these are rather gloomy ideas, but this idea of becoming extinct has always been powerful in the Afrikaans circles. I was looking at the speech by the I. Malan, who was father of Magnus Malan and Aaron Malan, the Springbok rugby captain. In 1947 he said, well, the English could always go back to England or to Australia or New Zealand, but the Afrikaners, if their language die, they as a people will die. And so this book came up to me more and more. And first of all, the first question that everyone would ask is, but why so gloomy? I mean, isn't the prospect rather good? If you look at the education, high school scholars had a 10, the last highest standard in school. There was they were 10% of all matriculants, people who passed matric. But there was in South Africa there were 10.6% they formed 10.6% of the matric pupils. But 20% passed with such a mark that they would be accepted by the university. Books, nearly in 2004, 25 of the books in South Africa, 25% of the books sold in South Africa was Afrikaans books. Now it's 49%. By the way, I hear it's women who buy the books and then the men also read it. It has got the largest publishing company in South Africa, and of course Naspers is the largest company in Africa. Now, how could such a language die? How could such a people become extinct? Now, the first answer is, of course, that perhaps one of the wisest sociological comments by Auguste Comte in the mid-19th century is demography is destiny. If you become a shrinking minority, you become very vulnerable. Afrikaners at the moment is about 3% of the population, 1.8 million people. They are, in 2030, they will be far less than 1%, far less than 2%, perhaps 1.5%. In 2030 and 2050, they will be 1%. So, and the citizen demography is destiny. Then, of course, we are part of a certain culture, and with that culture, or let's call it broadly a Western culture, of which Afrikaners and the English-speaking section is part. We're part of a culture who does not really know how to absorb or how to integrate people who are not white or who are not from European descent originally. It is simply Arnold Toynbee, who studied 24 civilizations, the rise and fall. He was in the early 1959. He wrote an article in the Anglo-American journal Optima, which is not read by any academics, but just by people who happen to be shareholders of Anglo-American. My father happened to be. And that article has never been cited in any other book before I cited it. They asked Arnold Toynbee, how would things come to an end in South Africa? And Arnold Toynbee wrote an article in 1959, and it's called Africa's Warning to the Whites. And he said, quite simply, I'm simplifying now, that the Spanish and the Portuguese had a way in their colonies of absorbing people of color into the middle ranks of their various societies, and also ultimately the top rank, one or two exceptional individuals. But the British in their colonies, like the Dutch in their colonies, did not know how to absorb people who were not of a different kind. And in the end, there was only the difference in India and South Africa and other places. There was only a difference in culture. I mean, they were different races, but the only significant difference was culture, and more the culture in the end became the same. Sort of a Western culture. And culture is not a very rigid dividing line. There comes a moment when the ruling group has no longer got the will to impose its authority on people of other colors. So they do succumb and they do hand over power. The British in India, almost within 2 years, they collapsed in India after they thought they would keep in India forever. And in South Africa, of course, there is the fact that no one predicted it in 1988 or 1989 that South Africa within 5 years will go over in ANC hands. But it's the reason. What happened? I once, I wouldn't mention his name because it was the off the record interview, and but I think all I can say, he was a very important person in the government. And I said, have you got a fallback position? And he replied, well, what do you mean? I said, well, this is really two countries. There is the northern part that is Africa-oriented, predominantly black. And there's the western part, which is Europe, looks to Europe, and it's predominantly white color. Have you got any plans, I asked, for transferring or creating a kind of a federal system which can accumulate more and more power and then in the end sort of almost go their own way. And he looked at me puzzled and he said, what then about us? And suddenly it struck me, he's a member of parliament for a Transvaal constituency. What he was actually saying, are you going to leave us here alone with all the blacks? In any case, the difficulty with the Afrikaners is not that they are so few, but that they are so dispersed. That they are living in 3 parts of the country, the Western Cape, of course, but the Gauteng, what is now Gauteng, and then the other third is spread all over the country. There's no district in South Africa where whites form a majority. So it's really a very vulnerable, shrinking minority. Now, when I looked at what I had written over the past 30, 40 years, I wrote a lot in English. First of all, because half of my career was at the University of Cape Town, but also because between 1970 and 1990, someone who in Afrikaner terms is considered as, let's say, dissident, couldn't really easily publish in an Afrikaans newspaper, an NP supporting Afrikaans newspaper. You had to write in English if you wanted to appear. And then I looked at, then I wrote a lot of, I'm very glad to see Tony Groban here. He wouldn't probably remember, but he had 2 cartoons in which I figured in different circumstances. He wished I could tell the stories, but I had a very good association with the Cape Times. I was a columnist for 20 years. I wrote for Optima, I wrote for Leadership South Africa, and so on. And then I wrote in various academic magazines. Now the problem with writing for academic magazines, academic journals, is that you're only read by fellow academics. I mean, that article is basically lost for the general public. Sometimes, if you're lucky, people will refer to it in a footnote or whatever, but it's lost. And fortunately, I'm with a very, very good and friendly publisher, who actually is a general publisher named Tafelberg. But because my book on the Afrikaners hadn't done too badly, and then the other ones also not too badly, and then the one that came out last year after a television series of 17 episodes, I think sold quite well. And Erika Oosthuizen, who is my guardian angel at the publisher, she said, well, okay, I mean, let's put together these articles. And this is how this whole book at the moment came about. Tony Ute, who I greatly admire, wrote a few years ago. He was English Jewish background, and then taught a lot in France, and also wrote. Then we moved to America, and I think he was perhaps one of the most respected contributors to the New Review of Books. He wrote that the Afrikaners are one of 3 well-known ethnic groups that will probably disappear in the 21st century. And I told Erika this, and Erika told me this. I said, well, coincidentally, I've said the same. The first problem with Afrikaners is that it's their dispersal, the fact that they spread all over the country. I've spoken about that. Second one, of course, is apartheid. It's one of the few issues that united the world in the 1980s was being anti-apartheid. And apartheid was described in the most, very often quite correctly, in the most negative terms. But the West somehow still supported the South African government because of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. But when the Soviet Union collapsed and the Berlin Wall fell, then suddenly the whole war game changed, because the West no longer needed South Africa to be under stable white control. and suddenly the West withdrew its support. Then what no one also expected is demography. The whole apartheid plan was based on flawed demographic projections. In 1950, Jan Saadi, who was the demographer at Stellenbosch, and he was a member of SABRA, he made a projection on which the National Party government in the 50s based their apartheid policy. The problem with that is that he totally, and he admitted that in 1989, he said at that stage there wasn't enough methods to be able to count a person, people like the Africans who lived, at least half, 2/3 of them at that stage still lived in very remote rural areas. So instead of there being, as expected, 20 million Africans by the end of the century, there happened to be 32 million Africans. So the underestimation was about 12 million Africans more than had been anticipated. So that was a major problem. The Afrikaners and the whites in general, of course, started shrinking as a proportion of the population much faster than anyone anticipated. All the calls on mothers to have more children, white mothers to have more babies, had little effect. I remember a friend of mine who was actually Jewish told his wife he must have a few more children because it's needed to maintain a kind of white dominant order, and she just said, "You can't do it alone." Then I think whites in general, and I saw that at the University of Cape Town when I taught the second half of my career, whites in general doesn't know how to deal with people of color that are on the same kind of educational level. They simply have got no way. Afrikaners and English have their difficulties in dealing with each other, but whites, and I saw that with the so-called Conor Cruise O'Brien rumpus at University of Cape Town. I was a lecturer, and one day disrupted one of the lectures of Conor Cruise O'Brien. This Irishman had, to some extent, also provoked them because he called their academic boycott a Mickey Mouse stuff, which was not the most calming words that he could have used. But one day, a group of about 50 blacks came up to my office at the University of Cape Town in the Leslie building, and the leader, he was called Comrade Ziku. He said to me, "They want to know where is the office of Conor Cruise O'Brien." And I said, "Well, I'm not going to tell you." And he stared at me, and I stared at him, and he turned back and said to his followers, "The comrade professor is reactionary." So I saw in the Conor Cruise O'Brien affair, we are having trouble in the future at the moment. And now what happened, of course, is the absolute explosion of black numbers at the universities. At the moment, there's about 900,000 blacks at universities, and 10 years ago it was 600,000. It is just the kind of numbers that indicate of such a magnitude that you can't really control it very well. You've got no ideology with which you can actually deal with it. And the same thing, the negotiations, the language was English, and most of the National Party negotiators, for them English was the second language, and apart from the fact that they generally did poorly, they also expressed themselves poorly because English was not their first language. And then, of course, and I don't have to elaborate, there came the Nelson Mandela factor. I had one interview with him in 1972 in his house in Soweto, and I had some problems with what he said, but I listened intently. But I realized at the end of it, I would just be unable to stand up against him in any negotiation. He simply had that power of personality, that aura of reasonableness, of compassion, of forgiveness, and so on. So I never uttered a single word of critical comments on him, although I tend to be critical of them. But then again, I had no political position. I was a columnist, and, but I do feel that if you negotiate on behalf of a certain community or a certain party and so on, you actually have to take him as an ordinary adversary. And the other day I looked at the email message that I received from General Johan van der Merwe, who was head of the South African police at the time, and he said he kept on warning de Klerk that for all his other good qualities, Nelson Mandela is a very dangerous opponent, and you must treat him as such, because you are negotiating the future of South Africa. Not as a colleague or as a friend or as a very impressive personality, but as a political adversary. Of course, the whole relationship between de Klerk and Mandela tend to sour in the end. But de Klerk tells a very good story about Mandela. He said, well, Mandela told it at his own expense. Mandela told him that in those years, in the early 90s, he toured the world to raise funds for the ANC. And then one day they came to Japan and they were having dinner with the Japanese Prime Minister on the 13th floor of a building. And Mandela started this typical sales talk about, you know, the ANC has got no other money and you have to appreciate that you must help us. And the Japanese Prime Minister said, well, I'm sorry, we don't give money for any political party in another country. That's against our policy. Mandela continued. And the Prime Minister said, well, unfortunately, you must just excuse me for a moment. And Mandela said, we sat there, and we sat there, and we sat there, and then it dawned on us that he's never going to come back. And I said, the Klerk said, Mandela told that with a laugh. He thought it was a good joke. In any case, now I come to the more difficult question. So, were the Afrikaners irrational in introducing apartheid? Was there any alternative? Now, what is usually forgotten is the limitations in the constraints, that the fact that there were two white communities that were not always quite in a happy relationship with each other. The fact that there were two white communities made any solution very difficult. In the late 20s, General Smuts proposed to General Herzog, let's go for the qualified franchise and allow educated colored people and African people to vote as well. Herzog said no, and for a very good reason, because you had a very large poor white problem. About 1/4 of the Afrikaners were actually considered to be destitute, not living, that is the definition of the time, in a standard that is accustomed to which, at the standard to which whites are accustomed. In 1960, Mandela sent a letter to Verwoerd and said, let us elect every year 30 Africans to represent the African community in Parliament. And the next election, 5 years later, we elect another 30 and then another 30 and so on. That way, one could easily integrate Parliament without any major disruption. But just think for a moment, on which side of the Afrikaners and English would these Africans vote in the Parliament? I'll give you two guesses, but the first one's probably the right that you would make. They would vote for the United Party. They would vote against the National Party. De Klerk van der Mandela didn't get a reply, and in the court case he said, well, it's very discourteous of a Prime Minister not to reply to letters that he receives, but he acknowledged. He wrote it in a tone that is not customary to letters that you write to a leader of a country. So, And then, of course, there's the whole question of Bantu education. I've got a chapter on Bantu education. Now, Verwoerd is very much associated with Bantu education, and it is, by and large, what the black middle class consider it as one of the most treacherous, the most disastrous events that happened in the case of the black community. And I think the underlying assumption that it was done with a malignant purpose, it was done with ill will. Now, I started looking at this whole Bantu education business, and I discovered so many things that is simply not part of the public discourse. First of all, there was no widespread support in the white community for the fact that the state should over the funding from the church schools and the missionary schools, black schools from the church, the missionary schools. In fact, the most leading liberal of the time, Alfred Burnley, in 1945 wrote that a member of a constituency that makes a plea for state funding of black education will be in danger of losing his seat. Verwoerd's own leader, J.G. Strydom in the Transvaal leader, said to him, "What are your plans with educating blacks? Because you know that the more educated a black person becomes, the more politically radical he becomes. Is that what you want?" And Verwoerd then used he said, well, they will still be, in South Africa itself, do the more menial labor, the more kind of unskilled labor, semi-skilled labor. But in the homelands, they would be able to fill all kinds of positions. In fact, if you look at the commentary on that in 1958, a very well-known American Africanist called Wendell Carter said, "Oh, this is a very sensible policy because it was also the policy of the United Party not to promote blacks in the so-called white sector of the community, the white civil service, to appoint blacks in senior positions, just as Toynbee has warned." And then, of course, because of Bantu education, in fact, Bantu education wasn't such a disaster that one would think. There was an academic at the University of Cape Town, Kathleen Hugh, H-E-U-G-H, who was the most respected authority on that. And she immigrated to Australia because her husband worked for the Cape Times, and he was, every time he had to give up his office to somebody else. She wrote that Bantu education until 1975, when the emphasis was in instruction in the mother tongue, in fact produced the best matric results ever. Now there's a reason for that, the numbers were much smaller and so on, but the matric results actually were very good. You had textbooks in the various Bantu languages and so on. Because the black elite in the cities were so much intent, like other African countries, on English as the passport towards success in the world, commercial, vocational success, professional success and so on, they simply wouldn't listen to any other reasons. And as Charles Simpkins once to me, if you actually have, you tell people about mother tongue education is the best form of education. I sincerely believe in that for myself. If I had to go and to study in English, coming from Portville High School, I would have failed the first year or two. As Charles Simpkins wrote, you cannot persuade people to be free. People don't want to be free if they don't want to have mother tongue. You can't do anything about that. Of course, it was much more the urban, let's say, professional black society, skilled laborers who preferred English. There's only one poll that I know of, and it was undertaken by the Department of Bantu Education, so one would have one questions about it, but it showed that in a nationwide poll, it was actually, black parents didn't have their children being instructed through the medium of English or Afrikaans, but very significant, very few, I think less than 10% supported education in one of the Bantu languages, that be the medium of instruction. Now, the Afrikaners, were they irrational? That is, in implementing apartheid. Was there an alternative policy that could have worked? One that wouldn't have inflamed the relationships between the two white communities, that in a kind of incremental way could have transformed society? And my argument is actually, no, I don't think so. I think like other British colonies, I don't think we had the ability in terms of our own culture to do so. In fact, Cyril John Rhodes, when he entered Parliament in 1888 or 1887, he made a speech in Parliament. He said, well, there's something strange in South Africa. In no part of the British Empire, that's Australia, New Zealand or whatever, do the white colonists clamour for the Aborigines to be given representation in Parliament. Only in South Africa. What is the reason? The reason he implied is that the Afrikaners always formed the majority in the white community. And therefore, actually, the only way in which the English could get to power was if there could be an alliance with with the people represented by the black community. I think what the white, of course, and I once told that to the clerk, what the white in 48 should have done is to try and signal out in a certain area that is a predominantly white-colored, European-oriented area, and say this is a white, this is a I don't know what you would call it, but this is a homeland for people of partly European descent or European descent, and the other half is then for Africans which are more oriented towards Africa. That could have worked, but I find it very difficult to see, given our electoral system, and we chose the worst possible electoral system in 1910, I believe this time again, for South Africa as a multicultural society, because the Westminster system rewards the biggest ethnic group in the electorate. If they can get their act together and stand together, they are sure to victory. And that's exactly what the National Party did, and they united the enlightened and the most conservative factions within the Afrikaner society. Then the rise of the Afrikaners, and I deal also in the book with the rise of Afrikaners in business, in the business world, the private sector. Of course, they were well represented in agriculture, but even as late as 1978, 76, I think, Afrikaners had only about 4 companies that had a kind of total assets of more than, and I forgot what the figure at that time was, but it is really insignificant. The Sanlam, Rembrandt, Volkskas, and Trustbank. These were the 4. Now, Trustbank went down about 2 years later. The remarkable rise of Afrikaner businesses happened only in the end of the 80s and, of course, in the 1990s. At the moment, half of the 12 richest South Africans are Afrikaners. What happened is that in the early 50s, the Afrikaner Broederbond, at that stage, most of the people in leadership positions in the Afrikaner community belonged to the Broederbond. My father also happened to be a member. They held a meeting of all the representatives of all the different branches in South Africa. And at the proposal that they discussed was that the state should help Afrikaner businesses through contracts, through privileged access to markets, to be able to get onto their own feet. So you must have a state-sponsored development of the Afrikaner business sector. And there were two people who were members of the Broederbond who stood up. One was Andreas Wassenaar, who was head of Sanlam, and the other one was Anton Rupert. And they said this is the worst possible way of going about it. You have to, the Afrikaners will only be respected by the English community if they do manage to build up their own companies without any state support. And that was largely the case that up to the 1980s, I think in the 80s, some stuff happened with respect to arms procurement, arms purchases and so on. But for most of the National Party rule, there was no intervention on behalf of specifically Afrikaner businesses. Sometimes general mining is mentioned, Gencor and so on, but I spoke to the person who was with Anders Oppenheimer and William Koetser, the actual, where the Anglo-American decided to sell goldfields. And they said it was actually a straight business deal, and the most important thing that Oppenheimer secured is that Sanlam would not expand its diamond business. We want to retain our monopoly in diamonds. And Oppenheimer got that. And I think this is perhaps the major, I often say the biggest favor that the English community did to the Afrikaners was to say, prove yourself. Without state help, prove yourself. Build up your own companies, let's see if you can compete. And I think, I'm afraid to say, in the case of Africans, sort of the desire for recognition will always be rather meager because it is, most of them is done through state advancement. So in my book, I, to a large extent, deal with the myths that underlay most of the controversies in South African politics. I look at many myths. The fact that it was very popular at the time that to see apartheid as sort of derived from Nazi thinkers. It is absolutely, it is so laughable that one could simply not even comment on it, because there were 2 or 3 of people. They were all in the north, in the Transvaal. We studied in Germany. Verwoerd was mostly influenced by his visit to America, to some universities there that he visited in the mid-20s, and there the new school of social engineering kind of appealed to him, the idea that you should actually plan to avoid future clashes. You should not wait for the clashes and then react. In the case of apartheid advance in the Afrikaners advance in the private sector. I write about that. I write about Bantu education. And then B.G. Vorster is perhaps the most interesting of all the National Party leaders as a personality. I had the privilege of, now India, I have the privilege of interviewing him in 1980, I think, just when Mugabe was sworn in, the very day that Mugabe was sworn in Parliament. And he was sitting there listening to the broadcast, and I came up to him and I said, well, my name is Hermann Giliomee. I do part-time work for the Unit for Futures Research. Thank you for the interview. He then was still Chancellor of the University of Stellenbosch. And he looked at me and said, I don't know you. I don't know much of you. All I know is that you're far left, about which I'm sorry. And I asked him, what is your judgment of Ian Smith today? I mean, was he doomed by fate to hand over to a black revolutionary, or did they have other chances? And he said, no, and I tell the story in the book. He had so many other chances. I said to him, well, look, I've negotiated with Julius Nyerere. You could keep your white rule for another 10 years, but then you'll have to make way for universal franchise. Then Ian Smith would say, no, I want 20 years. And then I would say, well, I've had a new arrangement with Julius Nyerere, 15 years, the white rule. And then Smith would say, no, I want 25 years and something. And I said, don't you know the story of the Sultan's horse? He said, no, he doesn't know the story of the Sultan's horse. I said, he said, well, the Sultan had sentenced 3 men to death, and just when they were being led away, he said, wait, if any one of you could make my horse talk, I will set that man free. And the next day, 2 of the men were being dragged to the gallows, and there they saw the 3rd man standing free. And they almost got me joke and said, look, we must talk to this man. It's our last wish before you hang us. We want to ask this man just one question. I said, what on earth did you tell the Sultan? He said, well, I said to the Sultan, make your horse talk. Yeah, no, it's actually my business. I'm in that business. I said, there's various possibilities that could happen. I could, the Sultan, but I added to the Sultan, I said, I need 5 years for the dogs. And he said, well, in 5 years, a lot of things could happen. The Sultan could die. I could die from natural causes. I said, the damn horse may die. Well, who knows, perhaps I can get the horse back to talk. Now, obviously, the same applied to Foster. I just didn't have the courage to say, but the same applies to you. Why don't you make the horse talk? Perhaps I should end with this story. In 1977, I think Foster was in Germany, and Marion Dienhoff, who I got to know is a very remarkable German woman, she was editor of the quality magazine Die Zeit, said that she arranged a special interview with Helmut Schmidt, and that he must talk to Foster and try to persuade him to embark on radical reforms and give black the votes and full participation in government. And afterwards he asked me what happened. He said, well, I told him, I said, look, we Germans had gone through, in this past century, through 2 world wars. We were totally defeated. And every time we recovered and we got up and we got prosperous and we flourished. Why don't you do the same? And Foster said, if the Afrikaners lose power, they will never get it back. And of course, that is exactly what happened. And the moment, I don't expect any resistance from Afrikaners, but I must say the recent announcement by the ANC that they will investigate the possibility of looking at prescribed assets that companies could be forced to invest in certain prescribed companies, like state-owned companies like Eskom and so on. For companies that invest the pension funds, they could be forced to invest in state-owned companies. Now, of course, it happened, the same was the case on the NP rule, but then the taxpayers were also represented in the government, and they were part of government, and they knew that government did it in order to maintain white rule. For a black government now, and I mean, I think the proportion of whites who vote ANC is still far lower than 10%, it's perhaps between 5–6%. Well, the ANC to impose that is actually to realize the worst fears of whites, that actually the ANC will go for their property. And I think it's a very dire threat. I think it is the most dangerous development since 1994. Perhaps, after the election, the Maposa will forget about it. I doubt it. I think there are very powerful factions in the ANC who actually wants to implement the National Democratic Revolution. And this will be the best way of going about it. Thank you.
Thank you. We now have time for some questions. Can I see hands, please? Yes. Shall I bring the microphone over to you?
Professor Giliomee, I'm an independent filmmaker, and I worked with Kathleen Hugh, who you cited earlier. And we worked with Neville Alexander, and we made several films on language. And I think the combined feeling of all of us was that it was due to the most unfortunate conception of the nation, engineered mainly by Verwoerd and Forster, which was that somehow black people could be cheated out of being participants in the South African nation by being given inferior nations based on Bantustan's language and so-called ethnicity and so on. And that unfortunately the terrible effect of this was when the ANC came to power, English was going to become the de facto unifying language of the country. And that this in education for black children was a disastrous consequence. That's my first thing, sorry. And then the second part of my question is simply about, you seem to try and distance the Afrikaans leadership at a certain time from the Nazi Germany. My reading is a little bit different, and I mean, I'm certainly not a specialist like you are, but it does seem to me that the Afrikaner nationalists very unfortunately remain steeped in the ideology of the master race for many, many years. And that this was, in a way, it is what compounded the inability of the leadership of the white Afrikaner nationalists to accommodate a vision of a unified South Africa. And in a way, I mean, the way I see things is that the English speakers and the Afrikaans speakers are dissolving now, in any case, into a kind of mixed nationhood. And that surely is a better consequence.
Yeah, I got to know Alexander quite well, and we really, I think you were friends, and it's not in the American sense of the word, but we were really people who knew each other well, and I think I had great respect for you. But I'm not so certain that the first question that, that it was a lot of apartheid emphasis on mother tongue, that the Africans and the ANC government chose English as the language in all the African countries. In all the African countries, even in French countries where there was a different kind of thing, the African country chose the language of the oppressor, of the colonial power. They chose that freely, and I think even if there hadn't been apartheid, if there had been, say, a mild form of segregation, they still would have chosen English, because that is the African middle class notion that that is the best way of actually ensuring success for you, upward mobility for you and your children. So I don't think apartheid was the key reason. The words of Aboud did great damage, I agree with that. The word that you are not prepared, would not be rise above a certain level. Gerald van Joen, who became Minister for Education, told me when he became Minister in 1983, for the first time realized how disastrous these words still reverberated in black society. The second question, just remind me.
Just about the fraudulent pursuit of nationhood for black South Africans via this idea that there was Zulu
nationhood, yeah. No, I think that is obviously, I mean, I always, it was the biggest mistake that the ANC made, to force that nationhood on the definition. What they should have done, in fact, I was a member of the Buthelezi Commission in the early 80s. They should have developed what we were proposing in the Buthelezi Commission, integration of the provincial Natal province and the KwaZulu, so that on second level you start with integrated communities, and then these communities choose their representatives for the national government, and that would have been a far better one. Frankly, I think the notion that Afrikaners were influenced by Nazi thinking, I think is absurd. Apartheid, the first time the word was used in 1929, and it was very interesting that it was used within the context of a missions conference in Bethlehem, Kroonstad. And the idea was that the blacks should have their own, we should step up our missionary work among blacks, and then we should form parishes for the blacks, so that they don't come to the white church, that they have their own churches, their own ministers, their own church councils. And that idea was then later on, expanded, and why not their own townships, why not their own homelands and so on. But apartheid for a full 10 years was purely a concept that was circulated in missionary circles, Dutch Reformed Church missionary circles. It was first used in Parliament in 1943 by Dr. Mann. First used by the Burger in 1994. So I think it is just one of the most stupid South African myths that do exist.
The Orthodox Brandtag and the war effort?
The Oswald Brandtag war effort and AWP having a 3-pronged swastika.
But the Oswald Brandtag was extinguished by the the National Party defeated Oswald Brandtag in the election. They put up candidates, they did well in the 1943 election, and the Oswald Brandtag disintegrated. There were certainly in the Oswald Brandtag people who actually had Nazi ideas. But the Oswald Brandtag was a fringe movement. It was paramilitary rather. It became sort of an object of fun here in the Western Cape. When Erika Tron was at one stage supposed to be a commandant and supposed to lead a brigade down the street, they said, well, this is just laughable. So the Oswald Brandtag, what one should remember is that I don't think that it's actually apartheid that actually was the catalyst for the Afrikaners to get together. It was actually South Africa's participation in the Second World War on a very slender majority of 13 votes. And one of the best historians, J.S. Barre, who actually was a liberal and he wrote to Cape Colored people from a very liberal perspective, he told Phyllis Newson, you cannot take a country in war with only a majority of only 13 votes. That was the alienation of it. I think if it hadn't been for that war vote, and remember a country like Ireland stayed out of the war, if it hadn't been for that war vote, I don't think we would have had apartheid in the extreme form that we had.
Clive Keegan.
Professor Giliomee, if I can just follow up on your remarks about language. If you accept, as you seem to, that the erosion of language rights lies in part at the core of Afrikaner alienation, isn't the same true of African society? African indigenous languages are disappearing from our schools, our universities, our courts, our public life, as much as is the case with the Afrikaner. Wouldn't the Afrikaner's security and future hope lie more realistically in solidarity with the erosion of African language rights than in surrendering your arguments to the likes of Solidarity and other rather strange organisations?
I think certainly that was one of the points that Neville Alexander always made. Look, I'll support you for Afrikaans, but then you must show the same support for the other African languages. And I think that's a perfectly legitimate demand, and I support it. I think there have been efforts to help. In a sense, I think the dictionary of Afrikaans language, which is based in Stellenbosch, has just published its 14th volume. They extended help and said, look, we can train people that draw up dictionaries and descriptive dictionaries and so on. That certainly is a way, but apart from Zulu, I think the other African languages don't show all that much interest in that. But Zulu have made quite significant progress over the past 20 years. It is Afrikaans is one of 3 languages that in the course of the 20th century developed from simply a patois, a kind of a spoken language, was usually used in a kind of a jocular fashion, to a well-developed language used in all functions of life. The only others are Indonesian and Hindi and Hebrew. So there is a lot of expertise happening, but the key thing, of course, is that you must have enthusiasm to develop a language. You can't do it in a kind of an abstract, almost academic way. You must get the support of people on the grassroots. That is key. They must have been, that happened with Afrikaans, and of course what helped in the case of Afrikaans is that they actually knew that these people would have the vote. If you can get them to vote, educated, you can also get them to vote, and they will vote for the National Party. I think the English language is doing terrible destruction, I mean, as a medium used by black students. There's a study at the University of Cape Town who, I think 2 years ago, which showed that those students who are studying not in their mother tongue at high school is 4 years behind pupils who study either English or Afrikaans, their respective mother tongue. They put it at 4 years that they are lagging down.
Professor, over here. Sorry. Isn't there a distinction between language on the one hand and culture on the other? Because Afrikaans is spoken by whites, by colours, in large numbers, but irrespective of the use of the language, isn't there an element of culture that attaches to the concept as well? So that whereas on the one hand you have an attrition of English on Afrikaans from a language point of view, the same doesn't necessarily hold true in terms of culture.
Well, my definition of culture is language plus history. The language that you speak as a prime language and also the history of your particular group, that I call culture. You can add music, you can add some other stuff. Certainly the Afrikaans people, more and more I think it becomes common not to say I am an Afrikaner, and I would very rarely describe myself as an Afrikaner, but I would easily say I'm Afrikaans. That means you could be white, you could be colored, you could be black, who happens to use Afrikaans as a first language or as a language that you cherish. The relationship between the Afrikaners and the colored people was very much strained by 1994. Very interesting, because if you looked at the entry polls for the 1994 election, virtually no colored person, no colored voter who had more than a standard 8 qualification voted for the National Party. And this has changed over the last 20 years, especially because of the ANC sort of policies also here in the Western Cape. That more and more, because I'm very, very critical of Stellenbosch, who chose English as its main medium of instruction, because the people who are suffering the most would be colored people. With the participation of colored Afrikaans people at Stellenbosch actually stagnated at about 1,400 out of an undergraduate body of about 19,000. I think that is a crying shame. And I think everyone should focus and say, look, I use the term, I said, this is the second betrayal of the colored people. The first betrayal was the 50s when you took away the vote. This is the second betrayal. And I'm propagating that one should introduce at Stellenbosch a proper parallel medium undergraduate course. So you would have an English stream and you would have an Afrikaans stream, and you could apply for either of these streams, 2 streams, and then you stay in the stream for the rest of your university undergraduate studies.
We're running out of time because Hermann has got an appointment in Stellenbosch. Is there a burning question? Yes, there we go.
Hi Professor, I'm Malab Ninaber from Netwerk 24 and the Burger newspaper. I'll ask my question in English just so that everyone can understand. I wanted to get an idea of what your view is on how this disappearance or extinction of Afrikaner will take place. Is it something that it will only be that the people who speak it will start fading out and dying out, or is it something that will suddenly happen because it's such a disparate group with few people in various places and not a concentrated group? Is it something that will burn out, or will they fade away?
I've got two English-speaking sons-in-law, and I once said to him, the English community in South Africa has done a miraculous thing. They managed to disinvent themselves. In the case of Afrikaans, of course, it's the language. When English speakers, English could, the ANC could decide tomorrow to, to rather have, say, Zulu and and Tswana as a national language, and do away with English. But English speakers will have so many other places where they could go to where English will be the language of a medium of communication. Australia, New Zealand, back to England. In Afrikaans case, if Afrikaans die in South Africa, it's gone. You can only actually have a vibrant language if there are proper schools and proper universities. Now, at the moment, there's only one of the 36 campuses where you could get your full undergraduate studies in the medium Afrikaans, and that is at Potchefstroom. I think Solidariteit is trying to develop private universities. I'm ambivalent about that because that could lead again to another new segregation within the Afrikaans-speaking ranks, because probably most colored people would not be able to afford a private institution. But the point is actually that Afrikaans need, what would happen if Stellenbosch goes, Stellenbosch becomes effectively an English university. The next would be the main Afrikaans schools, you know, Karel Boyzai, Jan van Riebeek and so on. Because why do you have Afrikaans high schools if you cannot go with that language to the university?
And I think that's a good note to end on, the disappearance of the Afrikaner. However, we have got a little present for you, a cartoon by Fred Tony Grogan. So you can, and it's quite a good one. Perhaps you want to show that up to the club. There we go. Thank you very much.